Hi class, so this is going to be our digital notes for period 6, both parts 1 and 2 from before and after period breaks. This is going to cover all of topic 6.1 to 6.14. Okay, so we also began this unit with an LEQ, and there will be an LEQ at the end of the unit. So that was the skill for period 6. And then before period 6, part 1 of period 6, we talked about more of what's on the peripheral happening in the West and the South, so more of the rural areas as opposed to the meat and potatoes of this unit, which is more about what's happening on the Eastern Seaboard, kind of in the big cities, industrialization and all that stuff. So we started off with 6.2 about westward growth, kind of picking up where we left off in period 5, where it was more focused on westward growth and then how that impacted the debate about slavery. So now it's about westward growth, but now with the lens of industrialization, urbanization, and immigration. And so we reviewed what factors make people want to go out west into that, quote, Great American Desert, which is like that Great Plains region, the middle part of the United States. We said that, well, there are railroads that are allowing people to make that kind of passage. There's the drive to get those raw materials back out to feed the industrialization of those businesses back out east. The Homestead Act is a government project where they gave 160 acres, like we make plots of land for free for people who are willing to move out there and get that land up and started and kind of working it into the economy, which greatly incentivized a lot of people to go out there and made it way more accessible for more middle class people to be able to do this. Because before, going west was more of an upper class endeavor. It's very expensive. Poor people still cannot do it. So it's still not quite the fresh start. I mean, some immigrants will be able to do that because they work for those railroad companies. But in general, the Homestead Act, it targets mainly that middle class kind of population. And a lot of the land from the Homestead Act will be gifted to railroad companies, which is something we'll touch on later. But the three main groups that we're focusing on going out west are miners, ranchers, and farmers. So miners are setting up, cities along the way, what we call boom towns, like those old Western type towns that you see in movies that are essentially abandoned as soon as the mining in that area has been completed. So as the gold rush occurs, these boom towns keep just rising and falling around, and they're paving the way for then more people to come out and just kind of populate those abandoned towns. And then ranchers are using industrialization tactics like barbed wire and such to create things like cattle drives. And like miners using deep mining shafts. And farmers are even using industrialization with like deep plowing techniques like dry farming, which is like the callback all the way to period 1 with Native American farmers and Native Americans and how they adapted, with their farming tactics in more dry climates. And then you guys did this farming simulation where you guys were trying to experience some of the hardships that Gilded Age farmers have to face. So you guys saw things that are completely out of their control, like a poor climate, there was drought, there's bad soil. Some of that is actually in their control because they don't know how to use the soil in that environment to have not to deplete it to where it's not reusable. Overproduction, that there are so many people out there producing the same goods, and so when there's an abundance of it, you can't get as much for it. So you have to drop your prices. Railroads are again something we'll touch on later, a monopoly at this time that is overcharging farmers just because farmers are an easy target. They need to use the railroads. And so we will target them with high prices. Trusts, which also mean monopolies. So aside from railroad monopolies, there are monopolies that hold other things that farmers just need in order to continue their business, like plows and fertilizers. Banks out east are way less likely to give loans out to farmers just because it's a more risky endeavor. And so when they do, not only do they, it's harder to get the loan, but then it's a high interest loan, meaning they end up having to pay more money over time. And they will more likely call their loan back early as opposed to giving them kind of more benefit of the doubt and more time to pay it off. Farmers are also subject to some of the highest tax rates in the country. And the currency system is something that we'll touch on in the very last topic of the unit. So we'll hold off on that debate. But then we ended with the fact that farmers are starting to organize. This is what one of the earliest attempts of like farmers essentially unionizing before unions were like a very widespread thing. And so farmers are really instrumental in kind of that idea of the everyman, like kind of like just common people, like forming third parties and like forming political groups to get their point across and get like real change happening. We saw that a little bit in period 4, like with the Working Men's Party and stuff like that under Andrew Jackson. And so this is only a few decades later, but farmers are just going to be on such a wide scale, like the widest scale we've seen to date, which is why it's so notable. And they're pushing for both economic and political reform. So they have a huge platform called the Omaha Platform that again we'll touch on when we revisit this topic later. But we can see these early attempts like the National Grange Movement, which is all about farmers helping farmers, trying to teach each other farming techniques, setting up cooperatives, which is where you try to cut out the big monopolies by farmers setting up businesses to help out other farmers. Like, so for instance, in today's time, I come from a family of plumbers. And so a cooperative would be like where, when my family needs to do a job, like a plumbing job, they need to go to a pipe fitter. Well, if the pipe fitter was also like that company was also owned by a plumber, then you're not necessarily going to get charged for that. It's kind of you're helping each other out. And so that's kind of what farmers did. Some other farmers could start side businesses that would eventually, supplement or, just support farming endeavors. Some of their early successes are things like the Granger laws, which made it illegal for railroads to fix prices using pools or to give rebates. But it took a long time. So this is something we'll again touch on later when we get to monopolies. But this is just one success that again is due to farmers. Munn versus Illinois is another success where the government said they can regulate businesses of public nature, meaning railroads, meaning that railroads are almost, even though they're privately owned, they were deemed public just because they were such a necessity. It's kind of like water, almost like an internet in today's time. It's like things that are almost basically essential to existing, but also because they're taking on public government land, they got to argue that. So Munn versus Illinois basically gave the government the ability to regulate railroads. Now we'll, in a few more topics from now, we'll talk about how those early attempts to actually regulate those railroads were very lax and ineffective, but this was kind of the first step, the precursor to even that being able, to be a thing. So the Farmers Alliance is kind of the political group that is formed. So with all these farmers moving out, we have, and the closing of the frontier. We talked about Frederick Jackson Turner's frontier thesis. The proper name of it is called The Significance of the Frontier in American History, but if you also just refer to it as the frontier thesis, that's totally fine. And so this is a piece of work that the ideologies behind it will cite back in subsequent units because it can be applied to other contexts. But in this context, he's saying that now that we've closed the frontier, remember, frontier is kind of like what you can see on the horizon, like the next step. And he's talking about a physical frontier here, like land. And he argued that 300 years of the US always having a frontier, like physical land bordering our country that we could conquer, has always shaped American culture, that has defined what it means to be an American, because it promotes this idea of independence and like picking yourself up and kind of go get 'em attitude, in the sense of individualism, that it kind of gave everyone the sense of like a fresh start or endless opportunities. And because everyone had that, even though it might not be 100% true, even though it felt like everyone had that opportunity, that has a very democratizing effect. So he said frontiers are kind of the social equalizer or leveler of society, because everyone can go out there and make something of themselves. And the frontier has pushed us to why our country is so industrialized, so populated, whatever it is, like it's pushed us in terms of our values and our growth, because the frontier always has challenges that we need to overcome, and so we need to rise to those challenges. And he's nervous that now that we have spread our borders to the continental US, and the borders north and south of us has pretty much been solidified, and we've settled those with wars, it's not going to really change, that he's nervous about what the closing of the frontier will then do to our American dream, and our progress will become stagnant. And so it's something to keep in the back of our mind, that this is, it's amazing as we're closing the frontier. Like we can really see his argument coming to fruition, this unit, but that nervous ticking time clock of like when we run out of space to conquer, even though we already own it, but once it's finally been settled, what comes next, that'll be answered in the next unit. So what impact did this closing the frontier have on the Native American population? The last thing we talked about was in period 4. And we said that, even going back from period 1, Native Americans are a diverse group spread all across the continental US. 2/3 of the Western tribes lived on the Great Plains. Partially that is just because as we have dedicated all of this space to white settlers, we have been pushing them into that. That was our frontier, and we kept pushing them there. So there's now a huge section in the next frontier because we just keep pushing them more and more west. And the last thing we really talked about was, they had been more nomadic. They've been hunting buffalo out there because of the horses that the Spanish brought over. We have had conflicts with them. The last time we really had a formal conflict was, or like any kind of major legislation that we talked about, was Andrew Jackson's Indian Removal Act, which relocated them out to Oklahoma, and the Trail of Tears occurred. And that was kind of where we left off. But now we have, again, ranchers, miners, and farmers coming out there, and we need to address this issue, which is what they call, quote, the Indian problem by the government. And so in that Indian problem activity, you guys looked at a couple of big pieces of evidence on how the government interacted with the Native Americans, and so what our impact on the natives was. We saw Indian wars, so we saw things like the Sand Creek Massacre. Again, not focused on in your book, but I think it just gives you more context of the treatment towards natives, where we had things like the Sand Creek Massacre, where a group of Native Americans that were technically under federal government protection just because they had been relocated there, and that was the agreement that they would be left alone. The Colorado militia, so the state militia, just openly attacked this unarmed camp, which created a lot of distrust between Native Americans and the federal government. So I think that's a good basis about why they're so suspicious of the federal government, especially along with the Indian Appropriation Act, which the government issued, which ended all recognition of tribes as foreign entities, which basically nullifies all previous treaties. So they're not going to be treated as a foreign nation that we can compromise with and come to an agreement with. They're going to be treated as like an invader or an enemy, like within our territory. So very different rules of engagement there. And so again, just another example, and not something that's emphasized in the book, like a vocab term, but again, it's just more evidence to why Native Americans have animosity and distrust towards the federal government. And it culminates with another war called the Battle of Little Bighorn. So this was a vocab word, with Native American chief Crazy Horse and one of their famous warriors, Sitting Bull of the Sioux tribe, gathered fighters to fight off the white settlers off their land, which is what, if you guys remember this from previous history classes, is sometimes referred to as Custer's last stand, because while they were successful in getting them off their land, General Custer, who had actually been a general in the Civil War, decided to try to retaliate like in the night, trying to fight them off, and just did not succeed. But the U.S. government does not want to leave that hanging. Custer's last stand was an embarrassment for the military, and then by extension the federal government. So the U.S. government responded by killing Sitting Bull, this warrior, and over 200 American Indians in, depending on whatever you're getting this information, some people refer to it as the Battle of Wounded Knee. More updated textbooks and tellings of this refer to it as the Massacre of Wounded Knee, because again, the primary sources make it sound like it was not, it felt very one-sided, and it wasn't them attacking purely Native American warriors. It was all people in their tribe, so innocent Native Americans as well. And then there were efforts to assimilate Native Americans. Assimilate means we've talked about this in the past, but assimilate in any context means to adopt the characteristics of the culture that you're in. So it could be something that we refer to later with immigrants during this time. So in this context, it's for Native Americans to adopt basically white American values. whether it be Christianity, capitalism, all the kind of English language, all that stuff. So Helen Hunt Jackson wrote this book called A Century of Dishonor, which is a major book. It kind of had a similar impact to Uncle Tom's Cabin in the issue of slavery, where it was an attempt to raise sympathy for a marginalized group. So in this case, it was Native Americans. And it does do that. But the thing is, it had this negative side effect where people thought the answering solution to that problem was to assimilate them, to provide them with Christian education, kind of strip them away of their Native American heritage and give them American values, and like bring them into the fold of like our economy and politics and culture. Again, not necessarily by choice. So, and with hindsight bias, in our modern time, we know that that is horrible. But during this time, they thought that that was, the answer to all the injustices that we have, the government has had in the past. And so an example of assimilation, one of like the physical embodiments of it, is the Carlisle boarding school in Pennsylvania, which brought in a lot of Native Americans, children from tribes, sometimes warring tribes, because again, there was this misconception that all Native Americans, despite tribe heritage, tribe affiliation, were all the same. And so it brought people with different languages, religions, sometimes, again, warring tribes together, and just tried to strip them of their culture, and raise them as quote unquote American. And obviously that experience to a lot of Native Americans is traumatizing. And it ends with the Dawes Act. The Dawes Severalty Act is its proper name, but now in your book, it's just referred to as the Dawes Act. So this was kind of that last ditch effort to completely break up the tribal organizations and take all that land away. So this was the reservation system. They took over 90 million acres away from Native Americans and sold them off to white settlers. That could have been from the Homestead Act or gifted to a railroad. So like less than a third was left for Native Americans, and it was usually the undesirable land, and that is where the reservations stand even to this day. And so they were able to stay on the reservations if they stayed on the land for 25 years and quote adapted the habits of civilized life, which we talked about what assimilation refers to. That's how they were going to be able to be granted citizenship and be able to stay on those reservations. So again, very limiting, very discriminatory.
Hi.
And then we ended right before break with talking about the New South. So we're picking up right after Reconstruction. So Reconstruction ended in 1877, and things were kind of hot and cold for African Americans. So we said, like, where did we leave off? We had the Reconstruction Amendment. So on paper, we abolished slavery. They have equal protection and citizenship under the Constitution, and then they have the right to vote. And so that is kind of where they're at politically. We know, though, that a lot of redeemers, so those former Confederates, regained control in major positions in the federal government and state governments. And therefore, it makes it very hard for African Americans to rise up in Southern states because the lawmakers, the decision makers are people who do not want to see them, succeed. But in general, what's happening in the South, before we zoom in on the African Americans, the New South refers to the South's vision to become a self-sufficient economy, more modeled off of like the Northern industrial model, but still very highly agricultural. They just want to introduce more modern industry, transportation, and more infrastructure, and a little bit more, capitalism to the mix. So again, trying to catch up to the North, again, they'll be nowhere in the same league, but they do industrialize a lot very quickly. But in general, the South is it's a poor region. Again, still very agricultural based. I think we left off, at the end of period 5, talking about the majority of African Americans, like freedom being sharecroppers. But what's the shocking statistic here is that more than 50% of white farmers in the South were sharecroppers, meaning that they are too poor to own their own land. So it is, again, just a very poor region, very sharp class differences. And any kind of growth that happened in the South was mainly due to the Northern investors, like bankers, and financiers in the North. And so a lot of the money that the South is generating will funnel back into the North. And they have a poorly educated workforce, whether it's technical training or just academic training. And so that hurts their job market. Again, hard to get loans from, big banks because agriculture is a risky business. But so overall, the South they're having a huge rate of industrial growth, but they're still very behind in a lot of ways. So what's happening with the African Americans in the South? So with Reconstruction, the Supreme Court seemed to uphold the racism that was continuing in the South. So we talked about the Black codes, which were things that aimed to restrict African Americans. They were slave codes when they were slaves, turned them into Black codes. And now they have just been morphed into Jim Crow laws. So Jim Crow laws are the name for any law that segregates or discriminates against African Americans. And this is what they'll be called for like the next 100 years. So this is where you get the very well-known separate washrooms, drinking fountains, and benches of public places. And that name comes from Jim Crow is the name of this famous caricature of an African American for minstrelsy shows, which is when white performers put on blackface and perform for white audiences in a very stereotypical kind of characterized manner. This is where you get a lot of the modern stereotypes about African Americans for things like, things like them liking watermelon, like that stems back from a Jim Crow stereotype, and why the history of blackface is so emotional, with certain groups. It stems back into like this iconic person or character that embodies so much racism and just years and years of discrimination. And then it's upheld by the Supreme Court in Plessy versus Ferguson, because with separate and not equal public places, that does not seem that it aligns with the 14th Amendment, but Plessy versus Ferguson upheld separate but equal, that it does not violate the 14th Amendment. But because, and under that assumption, while they are segregated, they should be equal in value or quality, but we know that that's not going to be enforced. And we ended with talking about all the different Jim Crow laws and things that are happening. Disenfranchisement, meaning your loss of political rights, particularly right to vote, of Black voters, is huge during this time. There was a 99% decline in registered Black voters only between two different election years. So it's massive. And part of that is because things that were instituted in order, like barriers in order to vote, or like literacy tests, right, to prove that level of academic education, like you guys did in class with the literacy test simulation, poll taxes. And again, who can afford to pay a tax in order to vote when many of these people are sharecroppers and poor themselves? And like political primaries are for white voters only. And so they put the ones for African Americans only in more remote locations. There was just less of them overall, which made it very impossible to get to. Now, in order to create a loophole to still allow white voters to vote, those that they couldn't either pay the poll tax or actually pass the literacy test, they passed the grandfather clause, which said that a man could only vote if his grandfather had voted before Reconstruction. Well, if your grandfather was a slave before Reconstruction, there was absolutely no way that he was really able to vote unless you were one of the very few amount of free African Americans during the Civil War prior to that. And so, yeah, that's the situation that they're in as of right now. And that'll continue for a while. Now, some African Americans will migrate north into the factory systems that we're about to talk about. But again, largely they just can't afford that. It's a hard journey to make, but some will migrate north. Your book also talks about these few reformers: Ida B. Wells, Booker T. Washington, and W.E.B. Du Bois. So as you can see, they have some differing opinions here on how to go about ending Jim Crow or how to attack it or / deal with it. We will focus more on these reformers when we get to the progressive era, but right now they are mentioned in your book. And so, I mean, Ida B. Wells is a reformer who uses more of the written word. So she has her Memphis Free Speech, which is a newspaper owned by all, and edited and written by all African Americans. And Booker T. Washington and W.E.B. Du Bois have conflicting perspectives on how to go about dealing with Jim Crow. Booker T. Washington is more of a, I mean, at the time he was accused of being a quote Uncle Tom, just for his more conservative ways of getting back or getting African Americans forward. So he's a former slave, and he preached what's called a green ballot, that which is money. Basically, that if African Americans could just get job opportunities and get money, that would equal power and give them more opportunities to fight back. And so he wanted to go about it with where like he established schools, like agricultural and technical schools or academic schools, anything that could educate and train African Americans to get, you know, into office or to get better jobs, whatever it is. But again, he's criticized for being maybe too accepting of the current discrimination and kind of working within the system as opposed to fighting the system. Whereas W.E.B. Du Bois is way more vocal about an immediate end to segregation, an immediate access to equal rights. So very different approaches, but we'll again elaborate on them a little bit more when we get to the progressive era in this period 7. So we ended, that is the, ended part 1, and then we came back from winter break. And so with going forward, kind of we're done with the peripheral kind of populations and regions of the United States. We're going to focus on the major part, again, I said the meat and potatoes of this unit. And I said Mark Twain commented this period, or coined this period, the Gilded Age. That is what this whole time period post-Reconstruction through roughly 1900, all the way maybe up to World War I start, is coined the Gilded Age. And gilded means that it's covered in gold. It's not made of gold, it's not pure gold, but it's just coated or covered in it. And so we were talking about what kind of commentary about this time period could he be making with saying that this whole time period is covered in gold. And it's not a positive commentary, it's negative. He's saying that while appearance-wise, there seems to be a lot of positives to this time period, and there is, it's not true. It's not 100% accurate, that if you scrape below the surface, there's muck and grime and negatives. So we want to see throughout, the rest of this time period, what are the positives, but what are the negatives that come with it? And by far, a lot of the negatives stem as a result of the positives that we're gaining. All right, so we began with like kind of a government and business opinion poll that I was going to introduce a lot of the ideas that are discussed in this unit. A lot of these opinions can be applied to modern time, but all these are new questions, such as, should the wealthy be able to, or should they have to give back to society? Should the government regulate the economy or regulate big business? Those questions are started during the Gilded Age. This is like the first time that those questions are even being asked. So that's why I wanted to generate those ideas and thoughts with you guys early on. And then we take a break to do this Econ 101 PowerPoint that's linked on Canvas, just to make sure we're all familiar with what we mean by capitalism, free market economy. Because again, AMSCO just assumes that you kind of have this background in it. So I just want to make sure we're all on the same page kind of going forward as we enter more econ related things with in period 6 and period 7. And so this whole time, while it is referred to as the Gilded Age, I also like to refer to it as the making of a world superpower. The US becomes a superpower, which is a term just used for a wealthy, powerful, influential nation, like a first-tier nation or a first class, whatever you want to refer to it as. So this is essentially our origin story. There's also a symbolism behind why I chose Superman. I'll get to that in a little bit, why the Man of Steel is kind of emblematic of this time period. But we're focusing on the second industrial revolution. And so just for comparison terms, I put the first industrial revolution up here just so we can put side by side these two different movements. So the first one was back in period 4. It was roughly at 1800s-ish to 1830s-ish. This one is from 1860 to like 1900s-ish. So there's probably 30 years or so a year gap. There's no hard and fast dates. There's not really a big stopping or ending point. But what's interesting to note is that these industrial revolutions, they're similar in nature. About they're both about us getting away from like agriculture or craftsmanship and more towards using machinery to mass produce things, more modern capitalism. So by definition, they're the same there, but they also correspond with several other developments, like the fact that they both correspond with war. The first one being the War of 1812, which greatly spurred industrialization in the New England area, really only. The second industrial revolution after the Civil War. And both is because during times of war, we innovate so much because we have to meet that wartime demand. And so it increases productivity, it increases technology and just innovation on such a wide scale. It's something that we'll continue talking about throughout this semester, especially when we get to World War I, World War II, the Cold War. That's a tale as old as time, is war breeds growth, like technological growth. So they both coincide with war. They both coincide with westward growth. That first one is all through kind of manifest destiny. We have like Louisiana Purchase, and but it's before the Mexican-American War, but we still have other more land acquisitions in there. This one, the Second Industrial Revolution, while we already own all that land, we are physically going, like, making manifest destiny come to fruition. Like, we're starting to really take over that land and settle that land. So they both coincide with westward growth, which again is an incentive to create more and invent more to meet that demand. And so they both coincide with a sort of market revolution in a sense that it changes this new introduction to technology and industry, changes our standard of living, changes the way that businesses do business. They also both, it's not on the slide, but they both also correspond with a wave of immigration. So something that we'll talk about in a couple topics from now is the first wave of immigration that we talked about with the first industrial revolution, which was more German and Irish immigrants. And the second industrial revolution that we'll talk about this unit is more Southern and Eastern European immigrants, as well as Asian immigrants. The differences between the two, besides the years, like the dates, the first one is more of a European phenomenon, mainly Great Britain, that trickled its way over here, and we just benefited from it on the tail end, whereas the second industrial revolution is more of an American-only phenomenon, and just which industries are booming. So the first industrial revolution was more coal, iron, and textiles, and like that's where you got like the cotton gin and like the law system and all that kind of stuff. Whereas the second industrial revolution is more about steel, oil, and electricity. And this is the huge one. The second one is the big one that everyone thinks of. That's like the one that's usually the backdrop in movies or shows. Because by 1900, the US becomes the leading industrial power in the world. We have the biggest industrial output. That is insane. We are a relatively new country, a young country. And the fact that we just surpassed so many other European and Asian countries is remarkable. So how did that happen? Now, this isn't written in your book anywhere. This is an acronym that I created, again, to kind of go along with the Superman analogy. This is what gave us our powers. These are the factors to that industrial success that span over multiple topics in your book. So the P is politics, that we would not have gotten where we got to without government support. Again, so you'll talk about later is that cozy relationship that develops between business and the federal or even state or local governments through things like subsidies, legislation, and just their general attitudes towards business. O is the outbreak of war. So in this case, like I mentioned, it was the Civil War that causes us to build up our industry. W is workforce. So again, mentioned immigration already, the second wave of immigration that we'll get to, but also wage laborers in factories. So we need someone to make all the stuff to kind of power industrialization. E is entrepreneurs. So those are the creative, talented capitalists that we'll get to, that, without that leadership, that these corporations would not have risen to the scale that they would have. R is resources, like the natural resources out west that we're trying to capitalize on. So it's just, some are new, some are just more in quantity. And then science and technology, such as railroads and other new inventions. So science and technology, again, is like a replicating, or I should say reciprocal relationship, that science and technology allow industrialization, they allow westward growth, and all that kind of stuff. But then we also then have to meet the demand of whatever industrialization or whatever our frontier is. And so we just keep creating more technology and more scientific innovations, and it just keeps feeding itself. So your book, I think it's topic 6.5, just name drops several inventions and inventors. Now, I only highlighted a few here just because I think they're the most major ones. And so I try to pick some also just spread out from different types of technologies, like because there's communication technologies, there's infrastructure and travel ones. So I just wanted to highlight a few here. So the first one being like communication with like the transatlantic cable, as you can see in this picture up here, we can send telegraphs across the world, like across the Atlantic Ocean. And we have Alexander Graham Bell's telephone. So all these are integral for businesses. These aren't mainstream into like modern homes just yet. And then we have the Bessemer process, which Henry Bessemer created this way of purifying iron, because iron was how we made most of our infrastructure back in the day. But he found out a way to purify it to make an even sturdier material, which is steel. Hence why Superman is called the Man of Steel, because that's the strongest material on Earth. And so that is actually why Superman is called that. That's why his whole idea is created not long after this time period. He's very emblematic of the second industrial revolution. So we use steel to make things like railroads, skyscrapers, elevators, bridges. I highlighted skyscrapers there not only just because they're very it's a good use of steel. It's a good example of it. It's integral for urbanization, just like all the others, but I wanted to highlight that one just because it allows massive amounts of people to live in these cities that are going to spring up essentially overnight. It's also just like a lot of these others, but again, I think skyscrapers are just even more so iconic or like illustrative of the Gilded Age. You have like these shiny, tall buildings. But when you so you can see like the Chicago skyline, but then when you kind of enter the city, you see more grime, poverty, disease. So again, just very symbolic of the Gilded Age. And then we have Thomas Edison and George Westinghouse, two integral inventors, both associated with electric light and electric power. Thomas Edison has over 1,000 patents that he created at Menlo Park, which is his research lab. So again, it's like a physical place, very emblematic of science and technology and innovation. And George Westinghouse is also responsible for like north of 400 patents himself. And then streetcar cities down here is a term used for cities that are popping up again as we're going out west. Like Chicago is considered a streetcar city because you guys might be aware that it's created on the grid system. That means that it was built with infrastructure in mind, whether that be for transportation and travel, plumbing, all these kind of things. Like it is way more mapped out and intentional in its city planning. And then I asked you guys, like, why do you think they're the most powerful, or who do you think is the most powerful people in society today? I look back at the Forbes 2018 list just because it has been updated recently because of the pandemic. And what you guys saw were a lot of leaders, CEOs, founders of very like just global wealthy companies, as well as world leaders. But we said like world leaders of what kind of countries? And then you guys said the wealthiest, the most industrialized, therefore the most powerful. And then we introduced this idea of monopoly, the monopoly game that has been around since 1904. It was literally created during this time period to teach kids about the joys and the woes of capitalism, to keep those values going. So in the game of Monopoly, how you win is by driving out all your competition and making them bankrupt. And how you win, again, unless you play with house rules, if you go by the rules in the actual game, you need to buy all of the ones in a certain color. So all the ones that are associated with each other in that industry. And then you can build up on them and charge people more money until you build your empire. So that's what a monopoly is. The textbook definition is the exclusive, meaning like kind of sole possession or control, or at least most of a supply, trade, product, service, whatever it is. And so because of that, you pretty much control all of it. And so that's the ultimate goal for entrepreneurs during this time. So the first three monopolies we're going to see are railroads, steel, and oil are the biggest ones, but there's so many other monopolies that exist during this time. So railroads are the biggest. So like they're America's first big business. So what happened? They're going to have great leadership that we'll talk about on the next slide. Capital meaning money. Again, they're going to have investors that we'll talk about on the next slide. Technology. So they're going to benefit from things like steel that are being created during this time. Markets, meaning that there is a demand for it. And so that kind of leads to all these other things that we're talking about. Labor, so a workforce. Like I mentioned down here, we have Irish and Chinese immigrants are essentially going to be building most of the railroads out west. And then government support. And the recipe is the first big business. Just to explain the level of growth that railroads had during this time, post-Civil War, railroads grew by 5 times. That is, again, a crazy amount of growth in such a short time. And it's due to all of these ingredients. But then the result is you have all these regions even more closely connected than they were before, quick, easy trade between the regions, more specialization between the regions, kind of like what we talked about back in period 4 when we introduced more railroads for the first time. We said that now the South really does not need to, industrialize because they can import all their stuff. And whatever it is, regions again still feel less inclined to diversify their industry or agriculture or whatever their economy is. And then major urbanization, cities will build up near like along railroads because then there's quick transportation to them. And then reciprocally, railroads will go next to cities. So it's kind of a give and take relationship. But then one of the unfortunate side effects of this big business that we'll talk about later is this cozy relationship, this close relationship that gets built between government and big business, and that will lead to corruption. So in the beginning, it could be anything like tax breaks, subsidies, land grants, like we said with the Homestead Act earlier, just gifting land to railroads because they want them to succeed. They are so they are so supportive of the railroad industry and businesses in general, which is why we created our 4 time zones to standardize business routines across the nation. So of the railroad empire, the capitalist associated with railroads is Cornelius, quote, Commodore is his nickname, Vanderbilt, hence Vanderbilt University. He consolidated, which is a bolded term here. Consolidated means that you buy up all the companies associated with something, kind of putting them under one umbrella. That's what consolidate means just in general. So in this context, it's railroads. And then he's buying them up, putting them all kind of under one centralized company. And he comes in and he's going to standardize their business practices. Like he's making sure that, because before all railroads were really haphazard, they can go any which way. They're using different size tracks, different gauge systems, and he's going to come in and make sure that they're all using the same thing, which is great. Like that's a great thing to make sure that they're so efficient that way. They're all on consistent time schedules. So that's one of the pluses of something like this. But then you also get, some of the negatives. So when you get so when there's what we call a speculative bubble, that's something that we'll talk about a little bit more when we get to the Great Depression. But a speculative bubble, as mentioned in your books, means that essentially there's a lot of hype around a new industry. So speculation means that people just want to get out on the ground floor and make money off of it. And so when there's a lot of speculation right now around railroads, because they're growing at such a high rate, people understand that you can get wealthy off them by buying a stock or a share of the railroad company. So buying a piece of business, giving them your money, and hopefully getting money back later in return. And so what Jay Gould did is he sold off millions, or many of these stocks of the railroad company, but he inflated the prices. He lied about their current value in order to make more money off than he should have in the beginning. So not a great guy. Rebates and pools are also other things that not 100% isolated to the railroad industry, but things that monopolies did during this time to just gain more money, more success, more power. So rebates are offering kind of kickbacks, like money back, to preferred customers, just to entice them to give them your business. So not as corrupt as some of these other tactics, but not a great look, especially when it's something like overcharging farmers in order to give a rebate back to, another preferred customer. And then a pool is basically an unholy agreement between multiple companies. So maybe they can't get sole control over one industry. So like, for instance, maybe railroads, like you can't own all the railroads. Maybe there's some other major competitors that it's hard to take them down. Let's just say like there's 3 in this scenario. Well, what Vanderbilt could do or other people could do is that, okay, well, we have our 3 different companies here. We can't consolidate, but what we can do is we can arrange a pool, meaning that we could all come together and agree that we're all going to overcharge. We'll all charge $10 for this thing that should be $5. And if we all stick to that, then we'll all end up making way much more money than we would have by trying to undercut each other. So it benefits them, it hurts the consumer. Now what Rockefeller, who we'll talk about in a second, was actually known for was creating pools and then undercutting. So after he got everyone else to agree to the $10, he is the one who charged $5, making everyone go to him and just completely cutting out the competitors. So very ruthless business tactic, but very smart. And then JP Morgan is a banker, but he is associated with the railroads because he helped finance this consolidation with Vanderbilt. And he was known for encouraging what's called interlocking director. It's kind of like watering stock. It's a vocabulary in your book, but we're not going to keep it necessarily as bolded right here just because it's great if you can remember it as evidence in your writing, but we do not want you to get super bogged down with so much of the econ of this, as long as you get the gist, like the big idea of the corruption that's happening here. But interlocking directorate means that, going back to my example of there are 3 major companies that are all separate and they can't really cut each other out. Well, what if I was the CEO, the director of 2 of 3 of those companies? That could obviously be a conflict of interest. And it's sort of kind of creating a pool with myself, because I own 2 different competing companies, or I'm on the board of 2 different competing companies. And the last 2 monopolies we're going to talk about are Andrew Carnegie's steel and John Rockefeller's Standard Oil. So Andrew Carnegie actually has a more unique upbringing because he came over as an poor immigrant from Scotland and created U.S. Steel. So his business tactic that he's most known for is vertical integration, where he controlled all levels of production. Literally anything that you would need, anything from raw materials to the selling of the physical product, he owns. So let me quickly go to this slide just so we can see a visual. So on the left here, you see vertical integration. So this is for the meat packing industry as an example, but he did this for steel. So vertical integration would be that I literally own like the land that the cattle are on. I own the cattle, I own the slaughterhouses, I own the refrigerator railroad cars to get to the cool warehouses that I also own, to the meat packing plants, to the delivery wagons, to the storefronts, to their what they're actually sold at, meaning that I literally never have to deal with anyone else for the entire production or selling process. So it cuts out a lot of additional costs by doing that. And it's very, very hard to secure that. And it's very smart. So that was his business tactic. Another thing that sets Andrew Carnegie apart is his more philanthropic reputation. Now, he does have some, several stories about him when we get to labor and strikes that we'll talk about that, don't paint him in a great light, but he is highly associated with his book called The Gospel of Wealth, where he argued that while wealthy people did earn their money because they were creative and hardworking, whatever it is, that they do benefit society because they create jobs and whatnot, but that he said, like, the wealthy person, or the person that dies wealthy dies disgraced, meaning that you need to give back to society in some way, whether that be donating, but more so he advocated for creating opportunities. So like things like creating jobs, maybe temporary, welfare agencies, things like schools, libraries, whatever it can be to benefit society and, just progress our country more. John Rockefeller had the Standard Oil Trust. So oil was his monopoly. If you see trust, a trust is during this time period means something different than in modern times. So don't get too hung up on that. But a trust is synonymous with a monopoly during this time. It's a way to disguise a monopoly. So it's something that he came up with. But again, don't get too stuck in the weeds about these econ terms, but in a very student-friendly, very basic way to try to describe it, it's that you basically turn over control of your company to a board of trustees. And so it kind of disseminates, like spreads out control over the company. So it just kind of disguises the idea that maybe one person or one group is getting too much power or too much control over something. It kind of goes back to that idea of a pool. So like, and kind of an interlocking directorate, like these kind of all dance around with each other, because with a trust, having multiple people calling the shots, that's where you can get people in the trust having multiple business ties. Again, creating a lot of corruption there. But what he did was a horizontal monopoly, or a horizontal integration is what your book calls it in the 2021 edition. So a horizontal integration is what the classic monopoly that you guys know, which is controlling all or most of the same business. And so going back to the example here, this one actually is for Rockefeller here for oil. He owned north of 90% of all oil refineries. So it's like if I owned basically all of one level of what's over here on the left side. But because I own basically all that level, everyone has to go through me and I can charge whatever the heck I want. And he made so much money off of that by having sole control essentially of all oil. And it's such a much needed business like steel. So it's also the fact that there's such a high demand for this stuff, this issue of supply and demand, which they can make so much money off of. And he was known for cutting prices to force out other businesses, which is kind of a tactic that you can only really successfully do once you've hit a certain growth margin, kind of like Walmart. But that, again, that's just more of an econ take on it. And then we ended with, talking about all these entrepreneurs, that there are two different perspectives on these individuals. You can either have a negative perspective of them as robber barons, or a positive perspective as captains of industry. So a robber baron would be the negative perspective of a businessman or capitalist, that you see them as unscrupulous, meaning they have no morals. You see them as selfish, greedy, maybe they have a corrupt relationship with business. They have a monopoly, which in class we talked about why competition is so good, because competition amongst businesses fosters creative changes. Like the fact that, if you have to compete with another business, that forces you have to create more products, keep your prices low, whatever it is, and that's best for the consumer. And so if you create a monopoly, that takes out all of those factors, that they don't have to innovate, they don't have to keep their prices low to get your business, because you have to go to them anyway. Maybe they exploit their workers, they hurt the environment, take up all the resources to create an unequal distribution of wealth. Maybe they don't give back to the society at all. Whatever it is, the list can go on and on. Or you can see them as a positive thing, as a captain of industry. Maybe you view that person as, they were the person, constantly moving forward. And so they just upped the game for the competition. They pushed everyone else forward. They benefit society with their new technological inventions. They stimulate the economy. They create more jobs. They push for urbanization. So they help cities to grow and thrive. They're philanthropists. Maybe they give back. Rockefeller and Carnegie gave millions back and created schools and libraries, all that stuff. So you can, someone can put this same individual in either category. It's all about kind of a matter of opinion, and just as long as you can give evidence to that fact. So what was the relationship between government and big business during this time? We kind of started talking about it with railroads, but this question of, should superpowers be regulated by authorities? And in this case, we're talking about business, because the business of America is business. That's the famous quote. So this is a question that starts during this time, and there are new prevailing ideologies that take hold and still kind of exist in our culture today. So government regulation of business is a new question on the table, and economist Adam Smith is pivotal with his argument about anti-government regulation, because he argues this philosophy called the invisible hand, that there's this invisible guiding force about the law of supply and demand that regulates the economy, so therefore there's no need to intervene. So as you guys know, supply and demand, if you have an abundance of something, and so much supply of something, and demand is high versus demand being low, that kind of affects how much people are willing to buy, or sorry, I should say, should spend on it, and that dictates prices. And then so no business can just be like, I'm going to charge $100 for this fidget spinner because demand is low for it. So he's saying that there's kind of natural rules of engagement. There's an evolutionary kind of habit sort of to the economy, that people will act in self-interest because they want to make money, and the consumers want what's best for them. So they're going to bring their money to the business that does what's best for them. And so those businesses will thrive. Businesses that don't adapt will fall to the wayside. He said it's like a natural process. And so there's no need to get involved just because supply and demand will work, capitalism will work. And so the government develops this thing called laissez-faire, which, or the full kind of title is called laissez-faire capitalism, but laissez-faire means hands off. So the government has, even to this day, taken mainly a hands-off approach to the economy based on the idea of the invisible hand. So that is the prevailing ideology that the government will take for years and years and years. So that is a huge buzz term. Same with social Darwinism. So social Darwinism kind of just continues that same hands-off ideology, because Charles Darwin's idea of natural selection and survival of the fittest, it actually is a very recent kind of thought in this time period. And now it's just being applied to society and the economy, that those same principles of natural selection and survival of the fittest can just be applied to businesses and individual people. And so that's the justification to use cutthroat business practices, the government not necessarily needing to get involved, social inequities, this huge wealth gap between the rich and the poor, just because it's survival of the fittest. And and the economy will work itself out, and so we have to have laissez-faire capitalism. So in class, you guys are going to be investigating basically the positive and negative effects of the capitalists in order to come up with big ideas, like big subtopics on why you guys think they should be characterized as robber barons or captains of industry. Again, it is helpful to know about the individual men, but subtopics meaning like just what's their overall impact, such as like creating jobs. And then can you give me several examples of them creating jobs or anything to that extent? So I think that kind of looking at it from those two lenses of like using the men as evidence, but also just knowing those vocab words themselves, both of those are good approaches. And then we start talking about this concept of the American dream, which means like why everyone, what everyone wants out of life in America. And in modern times, personal freedom and having basic needs met is what most people would classify as the top of their American dream, which I think surprises a lot of students just because affluence, meaning money, is what I think most people would assume. I think the reason for that, though, as we'll talk about in class, is that it's kind of hard to do all these other things in our society, the way it's set up, without having the money to do that. Money is kind of required in order to have your basic needs met, in order to travel, to even have good health, in order to have free time if you're not working 3 jobs. And so that is kind of part of the American dream / problem. So we're going to do this activity in class about the concentration of wealth in modern time, because I wanted you guys to compare it to this time, because a lot of historians coin our modern time that we're living in, kind of like the past 20 years or so, that we're living in a second Gilded Age. And so I wanted you guys to hear about what the concentration of wealth is and like the characteristics of the Gilded Age during this time period is, so you guys can compare it to today. So during this time period, industrialization did raise the standard of living for a lot of people with their new inventions as they kind of slowly make their way into homes. However, there's a huge concentration of wealth where it's at the top of this pyramid. It doesn't even look like a pyramid anymore. The top 10% own 90% of the nation's wealth, whether that be physical money, ownership of businesses, all those kind of assets. The middle class is kind of a newer concept. Like there's more levels in the pyramid being created, just because with business practices and more money in circulation, but along with more business practices, we have to create things like middle management. It's just because that's the new business organization as they grow into these huge corporations, and just more education-based job opportunities like management, accountants, salesmen are created, as opposed to like blue collar workers, which are more just day laborers at this time, different and nowadays. 1/5 of women worked, which is a huge uptick than previous. That's partially just because women are becoming single longer during this time. It's just a slow trend. Also just because in order to support your family during this time, women and children needed to work. It was very popular. So again, in more for children, factory settings. So 2/3 of Americans work for wages during this time, meaning that they don't have a salary. They're working for wages. There's no such thing as a minimum wage during this time. They're working at least 10 hours a day, 6 days a week. Like they're really crazy hours. Kids are not necessarily in school, and they're not working in great conditions, as we'll talk about later. So the iron law of wages is something that, again, it's a more economy ideology, where the law of supply and demand applies to laborers, essentially, meaning that if there is a huge amount of people that could just take your job tomorrow, then I don't need to pay you very much. And I mean, it makes sense, like that dictates today. There are a lot of different issues and debates about this principle being applied today, because our standard of living has significantly increased in modern times. So it's a slightly different debate, but it's that idea, again, supply and demand being applied to people and pay. And so because they're being paid so little, we have what's essentially called wage slavery, that people are so dependent on their very little income that there is no opportunity for them to quit and find a better paying job because someone else can just replace them the next day. And because it's such a dog eat dog world, especially because we have an influx of immigrants coming over, there's so much more job competition. And so because there is, again, too much competition, they are part of this cycle that they cannot break out of. And also kind of prevailing this time period is that myth kind of the American dream. So there's this book during this time written by Horatio Alger. And so it's called the Horatio Alger myth. And it depicts this rags to riches story. And so that's why this book is kind of synonymous with the rags to riches thinking, where they glorified the self-made man. And the problem is it made it sound like to everyone in the US that was like a realistic and everyday occurrence, which again, with hindsight and even today's standards, we know that's not super common. And so it made, again, justified the iron law of wages and wage slavery. It gave people kind of a sense of hope, maybe false hope, but again, it just justified the situation. And we try to compare it to today's time. And now this is going to lead us into the topic of labor. So how did industrialization and business practices cause labor unrest and eventually organization? So you're going to read an excerpt from The Jungle, which we'll also revisit in period 7 when we get to the progressive era. It's kind of written during that time about the progressives, but it's about the time that we're talking about right now, where it depicts the gross, horrific working conditions in the meatpacking industry. And it's horrible for workers, but it's also gross for the consumer to find out like what's happening with your meat just in order to cut costs. So it starts to, later on, it'll start the conversation about regulation, but right now, not so much. But we know as the switch from craftsmanship to more mass production on an assembly line is kind of a new thing. Dangerous working conditions. The reason why the kids are specifically used during these machines is that there's so many moving parts and that kids have tiny hands and they can crawl into the machines to, get clogged parts or whatever it is. But again, that laissez-faire and social Darwinism concept will encourage the government to not get involved in the plight of workers, even though they see this happening and workers are going to start advocating. So this is where we start getting unions. So a labor union just means an organization of workers to protect their rights. And they can use anything from like strikes, picketing, boycotts. Slowdowns means that you just purposely work so slow that you're actually costing the company money to just fight for better conditions and rights. And so this is all based on the idea of socialism. Socialism is the idea that about equality, kind of bettering the condition for the collective versus just the individual. And so labor unions are a socialistic idea. And the problem is the US is capitalistic and they don't like socialism. They see socialism as un-American. And so people for years, and a lot even to this day, have a very bad taste of labor unions in their mouth because they see them as un-American and anti-capitalism. So there are multiple labor unions that are mentioned in your book, but we're going to focus on 2, and I'm going to tell you why these 2 in particular. So the Knights of Labor and the AFL, or the American Federation of Labor. So the Knights of Labor and the AFL both have different ways of going about membership. The Knights of Labor is open to literally anyone, even minorities like African Americans and women, people who are skilled and unskilled, trained in any different trade. They had a huge, long lofty goal of social and political reforms that they wanted to do. And they preferred arbitration over strikes. Arbitration is when you basically, both parties, like the workers and management, will send their desires to a third party, and an arbitrator will look them over and basically just decide the compromise for you. Whereas, so that's kind of like a new thing that the Knights of Labor is really well known for. And then the AFL, the American Federation of Labor, led by Samuel Gompers, was the largest union in the country, but it had way narrower of goals, mainly just economic goals, such as minimum wage, such as an 8-hour workday. They only allowed the skilled trades, meaning that like things that you had to be trained for. So not just any day laborer. And they favored what's called collective bargaining. Collective bargaining is another thing that, you know, they do that over strikes. Collective bargaining is when both management and workers come to the same table to compromise, as opposed to sending it off to an arbitrator. Collective bargaining is like what, you know, teachers do every 4 years when our contract is up and we sit down with the school board and we have collective bargaining. If something like, you know, what happens with CPS sometimes, where they can't reach an agreement, they might send it to an arbitrator, which is usually like a lawyer that'll do that for them. So there are many strikes that are mentioned in your book. I wanted to point out a couple of them. The Pullman strike I wanted to show, and the Haymarket bombing, which is not quite a strike, but something else I wanted to mention. So the Pullman strike is one in the railways, led by socialist Eugene Debs, so big in like kind of the labor unions, who's protesting wage cuts that happened across all railroad companies, like all, again, at this time, all railroad companies are like, they have different names and they're spread out around the country, but a lot of them are under the same parent company. So again, it's similar to a monopoly, even though they're technically different companies. But there was huge cuts across all railroad companies, different workers. And with their strike, the current president at the time, President Cleveland, actually had to send in the military to end the strike. So why do I bring this up? Well, one, it shows, you know, it's a good example of the method, the striking, and why they're deciding to strike, because there's constant wage cuts. But I think it also shows, as really evident, that the federal government took a certain side in this, obviously being the side of the management, and the length that they went to end the strike. Using military against it just shows how, again, they're not messing around with unions. They want to squash that right away. So I think it just shows the level of like severity that they're willing to go to, and again, whose side they were taking. And then the Haymarket bombing. So this actually happened in Chicago. So this is why I chose the Knights of Labor specifically, because this is associated with the Knights of Labor protest that was happening in Chicago, which resulted in an outbreak of violence. And it led to like a pipe bomb, or like a homemade bomb essentially going off. And it killed several protesters, as well as injured some of the policemen in the area. And the thing is, even to this day, primary sources are contradictory about if that was even someone from the Knights of Labor, or if this is someone who was just kind of capitalizing on the protests and the unrest, kind of like with the whole like Black Lives Matter movement, with certain, you know, buildings being set on fire. Like in the chaos, some people like to capitalize on like what is going on in the moment, and so we're not sure if like the radical measures should be associated with the group or not, but regardless, they were. And the Knights of Labor was deemed radical, and that label got transposed to all labor unions. So it really negatively impacted the public relations and membership, you know, just of unions. Like union across all unions, membership will decline because they did not want to be associated with unions, because unions had a really bad reputation nationwide now. And then I want to highlight some of the other tactics that management will use, like a lockout, where they close the factory until workers disorganize, or just do what they want. So like a good example that I'm actually seeing right now in the news is like CPS and remote learning. So like CPS teachers, like that union, voted to have classes be remote this last week. Not cancel classes, but they just wanted to be remote until the positivity rate in their school went below a certain number. Not even as low as what the CDC recommends, but just to kind of put a temporary halt on it for worker safety and student safety. And instead of allowing them to go remote, CPS, like the actual leaders of CPS, just locked them out. So they canceled classes, and they disallowed anyone in CPS, like any teacher or student, barely being able to access any of their materials currently. So teachers physically cannot teach their students until they agree to get back into the building. That's a good example of a lockout. It also just increases public, you know, unrest towards they have a negative view of the workers, because again, then they see the workers as being unfair or hurting the economy because now, kids aren't getting an education in that earlier example, or, the railroads are shut down or whatever it is, they see it as then hurting the rest of society. And so it's a really effective tool to get the workers kind of back in the building. They could blacklist people. So they write their name, like all pro-union workers, like Eugene Debs, for example, up there, their name gets put on a blacklist, and that name gets circulated to other employers to not hire them if they catch a whiff of unionization. So again, another incentive when you need to feed your family. Yellow dog contracts are, and all this stuff is, or some of the stuff is illegal today. Yellow dog contracts are illegal today. But that is when you have to sign an agreement upon your hiring that you agree to not join a union. And then obtaining court injunctions or court orders to end the strike. Or they could just break a contract. Another one that I highlighted that we're gonna watch this video in class is the homestead strike. It's another one that's in your book. So this clip, I don't have it like on the slide, like the definition written out, so I'll just verbally say it. But the homestead strike happens at Carnegie Steel Plant at Homestead. And why I also wanted to highlight this one is because, one, it shows Carnegie and just gives a little more dichotomy to his reputation. But also it was another good example of the length that the federal government will go to, and sometimes management will go to stop the strike, and like what side the government's on. So in the video, it talks about how, they cut wages. And so they walk out and they're striking. And Henry Frick, who is the kind of manager of the plant instead of Carnegie, who's out of the country right now, Frick decides to hire Pinkertons. Pinkertons are a private militia, basically mercenaries, to come and break up the strike. And what they do is they come and they can't break the line of the strikers. And so they essentially open fire. It ends with violence. And so, again, I think it shows the length for management with Pinkertons. So it's just one of the other things I didn't mention on the last slide for strategies. But then because of this open fire, the government had to bring in militia, like military, to put an end to this. And when they did, they attacked the workers. So when they came in, they stopped the Pinkertons, but they will eventually or not stop the Pinkertons. They didn't get there like in that moment, but they break up the strike. So they're essentially siding with management again. Okay, so then we're getting towards the end of the unit where we're starting to talk about immigration and urbanization. So by 1900, our population literally tripled. We have north of 70 million people. And if you guys remember back from period 4, I have the picture over here that was on our period 4 PowerPoint of that first wave of immigration. So you can see where they were going, mainly to cities in the north or homesteads, but again, still northwest, mainly from Ireland and Germany, and just again in those earlier years. So like our population, the population tripling is mainly fueled by immigrants. A good example, like a case study of how much that spurred the growth of cities, is the fact that Chicago went from less than 4,000 people to the second largest city by 1900, and 3/4 of those people were simply immigrants. Yeah, crazy statistic. What is pushing these people here? It is unemployment due to the mechanization in their own country. So industrialization is creating less job opportunities because a lot of it's becoming, I don't say the word automated, but it's kind of that same sense. Overcrowding, homelessness, religious persecution, like the Jews. If anyone knows Fiddler on the Roof, how that musical ends is them literally getting pushed out. That is this time period, and how a lot of those people will just make their way over to America. And then pull factors. Why are they coming here? Our reputation for political and religious freedom. Again, religious, not religious, being friendly, but the freedom to practice your religion, and economic opportunities. So that first wave of immigrants that I have on the left is from period 4, where we have Ireland and Germany, Catholic and Protestants, mostly travel with families. There's some nativism, like the Know Nothing Society, but generally they do assimilate into American society, mostly because they have a similar heritage and culture as Americans, like coming from democratic or more capitalistic countries. They're English speaking, they had some labor skills, had some money. However, the new immigrants, much worse situation. So this is going to be from like the 1890s to World War I. So kind of around the 1900 mark, kind of after the Second Industrial Revolution has already boomed. These are more Southern and Eastern European folks, including some Asian, particularly Chinese immigrants, but just not nearly as much as the Southern and Eastern European. So these are Italians, Greeks, Croats, Slavs, Poles, and Russians. Now, physically, I think you guys can might be able to catch on why Ireland and German immigrants had an easier time blending in with the Southern and Eastern Europeans. They typically have darker features, darker complexions, and so they're physically different, which will lead to more nativism. Many of them are coming from very poor situations, poor countries. Many are illiterate. They're coming from countries that have very different political views, so they're non-democratic, and so people are afraid that they're going to change our dominant culture, of capitalism and democracy. Again, religious differences, Catholic and Jewish. And instead of families coming over, a lot of them, there's a huge group of men coming over alone because they just couldn't afford to come over. That's how poor they are. And it's men trying to save up money to send home to their family. So eventually maybe their family can come over, but it's so hard to afford that. So the journey over, again, industrialization does help this. We get like large steamboats that allow for cheaper passage. Mainly it's in steerage, which is below deck, which is in the movie Titanic, where they're having the whole dance party below. That's steerage, and that's where in that movie they're all foreigners in the basement, and mostly Western European folks, like wealthy Western Europeans, kind of like maybe German and Irish during this time, French, English are above. And then once they dock here, there's two places that they can go. Angel Island is the one on the West Coast, which makes sense for Asian immigrants because that is the first part of America that they'll hit. So that's in San Francisco. That's a smaller scale. Ellis Island is obviously the big one in New York, and that's the port for European arrivals. That just shows you the amount of people coming over because we had to set up a point to funnel these people in. And they were coming in such numbers that the government was trying to regulate it, actually, just because of the sheer numbers. And so that's where we start having literacy tests in order to even come into the country, very similar to the literacy test to vote, rigorous medical exams, and taxes or fees in order to enter the country. And again, these people are poor, so they're not going to be able to do that. They're illiterate, they don't speak English. So a lot of this is meant to just discourage and prevent the immigration. I have you guys read the Oath of Naturalization in class. So you guys can see how there are certain similarities between this oath and the oath of office that our president and other high officials take. There's specific language in here. So this is the oath of naturalization that people take today as well. That there's language in here to denounce your foreign allegiances because they just want you to be 100% loyal to capitalism, democracy, the American government, no foreign government, no one like the Pope, like no foreign entity. So I have you guys brainstorm what are some of the anti-immigration or nativist arguments that you've heard in current political climates, and a lot of them are going to be the exact same nativist arguments that you see during this time. This is the famous cartoon called Looking Backwards by Puck. It is it's at the bottom. It says they would close to the newcomer the bridge that carried their fathers over, clearly saying how hypocritical the current bigwigs of the country are, that they're gonna be very anti-immigrant when many of them are the children of immigrants or a few generations away, and that's what made this country what it is. So what's it like living in America? Well, the first group that is targeted legislation-wise is going to be the Chinese immigrants, just because they had the most nativism at their time, just because there is zero cultural understanding about Asian countries during this time. At least with the other European, there was maybe a little bit more familiarity, but I mean, they all face nativism, but the Chinese in particular had their immigration completely banned with the Chinese Exclusion Act. It also sometimes is called the Immigration Act of 1882. Who is really going to support this? I mean, general nativists, like general racists, but also in particular, labor unions are going to agree to ban immigration because they don't want the job competition. Protestants who just don't like people who practice other religion, and in general, people who practice or preach social Darwinism, that survival of the fittest. So mass immigration and also internal migration, so just people moving around different parts of the country, like I said, African Americans moving north or other migration patterns, led to the development of major cities. That's why a lot of cities, like I said with Chicago earlier, just boomed overnight. And because of such a rapid growth, it leads to maybe sometimes a sloppy development. And so the immigrants themselves take part or like impact the way that cities do form. They form ethnic neighborhoods. Like you obviously want to settle with people who are similar to you. And so they form certain ethnic neighborhoods. This is why Chicago has its notorious pockets around its city. This is also why people sometimes call them ghettos. That's kind of obviously the negative interpretation of the people of similar heritage living together. But because they can't afford good housing and they're basically going up overnight, they form tenement housings in order to address the immigrants, which is just cheap apartments. Eventually, they just become what we refer to as like slums, and they're really overcrowded. So that means that they're riddled with disease. They tend to be very unsafe. There's high crime rates in these areas, and they're just because there's poverty. And this is where we start to see more affluent, like richer people starting to slowly move out to the suburbs, kind of move away from cities. But businesses will flock towards cities in order to get them into the workforce. But this leads to the awakening of early efforts to reform. So this is not the progressive movement just yet. It's a precursor to it, but urbanization makes social problems very visible to the middle class because they are all living together now. It's hard to ignore these class disparities and all these issues, especially with immigrants coming in. And so, like always, as we talked about in the past, it tends to be white middle class women who drive a lot of these reforms. And so you see things like settlement houses, one of the most famous one being Jane Addams's Hull House in Chicago, which is that's what the picture is. It's on UIC's campus. It's a museum, you can go there, but it's basically a halfway house for immigrants to arrive, and they provide services to the newcomers, like how to teach them English, about American custom, maybe get them job training, whatever it is. So you have settlement houses. And then you have the social gospel movement, which is different than the gospel of wealth by Andrew Carnegie. A lot of students mix those up. The social gospel is the Christian organizations, like it's like the philosophy behind a lot of Christian organizations that created like the Salvation Army. So like gospel of wealth refers to specifically how wealthy people need to treat the economy. Social gospel is how like society needs to help each other. So like really think about the wording and the definition. And then you also have the Women's Christian Temperance Union, the WCTU, which we actually had talked about back in period 4, is coming back because they see alcohol as a social vice that is particularly plaguing this time period, especially poor people, like day laborers and immigrants that are falling prey to it. So they're trying to preach abstinence for that. And the last thing about immigration is this municipal corruption that is forming. As cities are rising overnight, political parties in the cities are trying to obviously have a city for their own. Like Democrats and Republicans during this time want to make blue or red cities and states. And so political machines are basically a group of people from a certain party that try to have tight control over the city's politics. So for instance, a very popular, like a very well-known one was Tammany Hall. And it's called Tammany Hall because there was a physical building for it, but it's also just the name of the group, was a democratic political machine in New York City. And every machine has a boss. So kind of someone at the head, basically it's a mob, it's a political mob. And the boss is responsible for coming up with their business strategies, handing out jobs to loyal people. So it's like where you get the patronage, kind of like the spoil system too. So Boss Tweed of Tammany Hall, ran New York City essentially. No one has seen Gangs of New York. Tweed is in that, featured in that movie. But in a lot of major cities, this becomes an issue, this corruption. Chicago is also really well known for this too. We have a history of corruption. The problem is, and why this is associated with immigrants, is just because as immigrants fuel urbanization, political machines dominate cities. And then because immigrants are flying to these cities, immigrants are preyed upon by the political machines. This is how they can gain a lot of traction, by promising things to immigrants, such as, vote for me, I can help you with better housing, I can help you get jobs, I can protect you. And so political machines will just prey on immigrants. Now, the problem is political machines maybe they can do some positives, maybe by, once they do all of this behind the scenes work to get someone elected, maybe that person can create change. The problem is, a lot of the times, because they're associated with this corruption, they might not necessarily get a lot done. And I'm gonna hold off getting way into that, just because that's what the whole last topic of this news at. So I'm gonna save it for in a minute. And so the goal of the activity that we're doing in class, and you can watch this video as well, is to understand how industrialization, urbanization, and immigration all impact each other. You need to understand that kind of three-way flowchart process. All right, so now we're getting to the final topic. So I said, in modern times, which political party is more associated with big business? Do they support or dislike government intervention in the economy? Which is the Republican Party. The Republican Party in modern times is associated with business. And we know the Northern Industrial Region has been Republican ever since the Republican Party was born. And they've always been associated with big business. But we know in today's time, they are not fond of government intervention. That was a huge part of anyone who's Republican, like Trump's platform, is they're anti-government involvement, but not during this time period. In the North, Republicans at this time are on the left side of the political spectrum. They have always been kind of pro big government and big business. So what the heck happened? So I just traced again the development of the political parties over time, whereas the left is always the side that favors big government and the right always favors the small government. So the shift that happened is Republicans formed in the North under the whole umbrella. What united all of them was the fact that they were Northerners. It was a combo of industrial Whigs, pro-government Whigs, and Democrats in the North, even though they were agricultural. What united them was that they were all in the North and anti-slavery. Now that slavery is gone, Republicans kind of find a new thing to rally behind, which is their business. That's kind of uniting thing about them. Maybe not so much all the Northern Democrats. They kind of just go back to being Democrats. But what Republicans realize is that government involvement in their business initially is a good thing, that the government can do things to help them. That's what we've talked about all first semesters, things like tariffs. But then they start realizing that there might not be great value if the government steps in too much. So we have Republicans in the North, again, pro-business, pro-protected tariffs, pro-big government. That's what the road has been so far. As Democrats are mainly in the South, pro-states' rights, limited federal government involvement. Now, the federal government in general is also nicknamed the Millionaires Club, just because over half of the current Senate has passed legislation to support businesses that they're connected to. Basically, over half the Senate has been bought by big business. And if you see the word graft, I just want to clarify what the word graft means. I'm always thinking of like in places like the UK, where it means to flirt with people, but to graft means it's to use your political power for personal gain. Which again, if you're someone who kind of watches those things like Love Island UK or something like that, they always say to graft. It does mean to kind of employ your kind of tactics, lay on thick with someone in order to kind of exploit the situation. So that's kind of where that term comes from. It's a kind of exploitative. So what was the relationship between government and big business during this time? So like I said, this question of should superpowers be regulated by authorities? What mentality has the government taken up to this point in this unit regarding the economy and society? It's been laissez-faire and social Darwinism. And so there has been basically no reason for state or government officials, like federal government officials, to do anything. So they're at a stalemate. They are complacent. They just don't do anything. And there's several other reasons for that. Besides those prevailing ideologies, there's a thing, like in your book, it lays out three things. There's popular politics, meaning that there is such a high voter turnout after the Civil War, just because there's such strong party identification. The Civil War made people very staunchly Republican or very staunchly Democratic because of the issue of slavery. And so post-Civil War, people just want to capitalize on it, and they lean even harder into the stereotypical things that their party likes or don't like. And so they're not really, there's no middle ground, and there's no one really they're challenging them. And then there is a new kind of formula for this time, that the more money a candidate raises, the more likely they will win an election. Or popular campaigning is a thing, especially with high voter turnout up here. Popular campaigning is expensive, but it's necessary because the common people can vote. It's been a few decades now that has started. And so where can government officials go? Who are the wealthy people in society that they can go to in order to secure money to fund a very expensive election? Businesses. They already have a relationship with them because, of like businesses, or they wanted to support business early on because they realized that was good for the economy. But that unholy relationship gets exploited and just grows once they realize that they can essentially be bought. So big businesses will essentially buy people in Congress to pass legislation that helps or hurts their business in order for that payout to fund that person's campaign. And also, when a certain business buys a politician, politicians can, business people could force, because right now there's no such thing as a secret ballot, they can force their workers to vote or not to vote for a certain politician, which can again scare politicians. So there's just so many things there, that so much corruption that can be going on. And then after the Civil War, the government also just becomes weak and complacent because they don't want to alienate voters. So along with this, popular campaigning and the fact that there's just really no need for them to get involved. They don't believe in getting involved in this time. So there's so much party patronage, meaning that it's all about a game of just winning elections, holding your seat, providing and passing on jobs to your friends and people in your party, making your business connections, staying, and then so they can just fund your next campaign, but not actually accomplishing anything. Now, there will be some early, I'm going to put quote unquote attempts to do some kind of economic intervention. Partly it's just because of some of the vocalness of early farmer groups and labor unions. So trusts and monopolies are starting to be scrutinized by the middle class. So it's not just labor, all these wage earners, but just other laborers, higher ups in general. So I think that once the middle class starts getting a little bit more on an issue, then that's when the federal government is more likely to get involved. And so you have early attempts like the Sherman Antitrust Act, which is the first federal law on the books to block monopolies, making them illegal. The problem is it is too vaguely worded in its definition about what a monopoly is, and it's not really enforced. Now, U.S. versus E.C. Knight Company is a Supreme Court case that ruled, its ruling essentially will allow monopolies to continue because it solidified the fact that the Sherman Antitrust Act only applied to monopolies that dealt with selling, but not manufacturing, which most of the monopolies are in manufacturing and production sectors. And so by allowing the green light on 90% of the monopolies to continue, then it gave the Sherman Antitrust Act essentially no bite. And then we know the farmers kept advocating for regulating railroads. Munn v. Illinois said that they could. So Wabash versus Illinois says that while the Supreme Court can regulate railroads because they're public in nature, it can't regulate interstate regulate interstate commerce. And so those almost seem like contradictory, so they like almost can't touch the railroads. It just becomes very murky. And then you have the Interstate Commerce Act, which required railroad rates to be, quote, reasonable and just. So it's such vague wording. So again, it becomes very laxly enforced just because there's not tight criteria. And they do set up the Interstate Commerce Commission, which is now a formal non-temporary group to regulate interstate business, but again, it's not super enforced, and people in the government have already been bought. Like, there is no incentive for government officials to attack monopolies when they are being backed or funded by many of them. And the last thing we're going to talk about is the money problem. So I mentioned this way back in the beginning when we talked about farmers. So the money problem is the fact that there is not enough money in the economy to go around, partly just because there's a really big concentration of wealth disparity. And so there's, and again, I don't want to get too into the weeds on this issue. Like, I know that this is going to start like it's an abstract idea for some folks. So do not get too dug into this. As long as you get the gist of the argument, then you're good. But people who don't have very much money, like debtors, farmers, small businesses, want something that's called easy or soft money, meaning that it is not backed by silver or gold, that we could just kind of all collectively say that this piece of paper, this greenback, which is what paper dollars used to be called, this greenback, if we can all just agree that it's worth something, then it is worth something. And so because I can just endlessly print it and put more money into circulation, it'd be easier to get and pay back loans. People who are also in favor of just printing more money would also be in favor of the unlimited coinage of silver, meaning just you can endlessly make more silver coins. Again, it's not necessarily backed by anything. Now bankers, creditors, and investors want something called hard money, meaning it is backed by gold, that thing, that greenback, that coin is symbolic of something like gold that does not lose its value, that it is symbolic of gold sitting like in a vault somewhere. And because it represents that, that this thing does not just, it inherently has value. So the government is going to support this hard money and in high tariffs in general. That's kind of what it's always done. Now, some other things that are mentioned in your book, we're not going to keep them as vocab terms, but just so you can get a sense of the story. The crime of 1873 is what debtors, farmers, and small businesses, again, people without money, call the time that Congress tried to recall all the greenbacks from circulation and stop the coining of silver, meaning that basically only gold was going to be used as currency. So there was, again, huge concentration of wealth, and it just got sucked up. Anything that was circulating in the lower part of that pyramid just got sucked up. Now, the Bland-Allison Act does reintroduce some coinage of silver, but a limited amount. Basically, what could be like still sort of backed by gold, but just less valuable. But again, this is a huge problem for a group that has already become more politically active, like the farmers. So what is a grassroots movement? So that term grassroots movement means that it is from the ground up, it is grown from the ground and grows upward. So grassroots movement meaning that it's more about everyday people. It's not top down from the government down. It's everyday people. So in this sense, we're talking about farmers. So you will not need to know all this. I put all this here just so you can understand the story of it. So you won't need to know these different elections, but just so you can understand what the heck is going on. So the election, these subsequent elections, there's kind of a back and forth between the Democrats and the Republicans. So that's kind of the gist of it. So in the election of 1884, Grover Cleveland is elected. That's the first Democrat since 1856. So since the beginning of the Civil War, the Republicans have had control of Congress and the presidency for over 30 years, and that scared the heck out of Republicans. So with Cleveland in there, he does pass the Civil Service Act, which is supposed to address some of the corruption by requiring the passing of certain exams for government jobs. So you can prove that you're qualified, so you can't just be handed a job like the spoil system. So it's supposed to try to target party patronage. Same with limiting donations to party people. So again, like limit corruption. And then the election of 1888, Democrat Cleveland versus Republican Harrison. Harrison won. So Cleveland lost. Republicans are back in. So Republicans are like, okay, we're back in. So they feel the need to start reforming just in order to keep voters. So that is why they passed things like the Sherman Antitrust Act. Because clearly, like the voting base is seeing that they wanted something like what Cleveland was saying, that he was arguing for some kind of reform, like the Civil Service Act, like he posted or made, and he was advocating for the Sherman Antitrust Act because Democrats are a lot of Southerners and like Westerners, like farmers. So Harrison, against what a lot of Republicans would want, passed the Sherman Antitrust Act and increased some coinage of silver. The Farmers Alliance that we talked about way back when has now multiplied and has become a third party called the Populist Party, which pop means people, but it's called the Populist Party, which is attacking laissez-faire capitalism and social Darwinism. And they want to unite people of all classes, all races, kind of all trades, but it's mainly farmers. But they do see themselves as the People's Party. They just want to represent just everyday people against a corrupt government and unfair capitalism. And that Omaha platform that the Farmers Alliance that I mentioned earlier was forwarding, the Populist Party is forwarding it. So they want popular election of senators, like they just want a direct popular vote of state senators. And then they want initiatives and referendums, something that we'll talk about. This is not passed now. It's something that we'll talk about a little bit more in period 7 when we get to progressivism, but both of those would allow more political participation and say from everyday people. Unlimited coinage of silver, a graduated income tax, meaning the more you make, the more you pay. Public ownership of railroads and telephones. So again, essentially allowing government oversight of huge entities and monopolies. Fair loans. So like you can't overcharge like an interest rate or something like that based on someone's profession, and an 8-hour workday. So that would also help like industrial workers. So this is really a widespread political and economic platform. All right, we're almost done. So election of 1892. So the populist candidate James Weaver does get on the ballot, and he gets over 1 million votes and 22 electoral votes. That it's one of the only times in American history that a third party secures any electoral votes. So that is a huge feat, huge, because the two-party system is so pervasive. But still, Democrat Cleveland won back office, which gives him the title of the only president in history that's his 2 terms were non-consecutive. But again, now there's still this tug of war between the Democrats and Republicans. And simultaneously, there is an economic panic. Now, a lot of people are going to point their fingers to the fact that it's because of capitalism, that the government could have come in and regulated how much everyone was producing, how much they were charging for it, because since everyone is overproducing, like farmers and industrial businesses, that prices are starting to drop. And so people are saying that this could be evidence for why we need government regulation. But regardless, there seems to be a shakeup in voting. And here's where we're ending. The election of 1896. So this is a very pivotal election, and one of the ones that you will need to know for second semester. It's the first one kind of on the vocab list of ones to need to know. So Democrats are discredited by the panic. No matter what whenever that happens in history, whenever there's a major event, especially an economic one that happens, whoever's in charge just immediately gets discredited, and then usually there's a swing in the other direction, like who people are voting for. But there's kind of a split now that's happening between the Democrats. So there's a split between more conservative Democrats like Cleveland, who are still like more about the gold standard. And then you have way more liberal, reform-minded ones like that are basically the populists that are breeding out of the Democrats, and they're looking for a person to rally behind, like a leader. And here comes William Jennings Bryan. He's a name kind of like Henry Clay. William Jennings Bryan is kind of like the Henry Clay of second semester. He'll just keep coming back. So William Jennings Bryan, this is the first time running for president, but he'll run for president 4 times, never become president. So he's the Democrat candidate, but under the Populist Party, essentially. And the reason why they picked him, like why all of a sudden he was like, yes, that's our guy, is because he gave this thing called the Cross of Gold speech, where he attacked the gold standard. He was really well known for giving a lot of speeches. That's why William McKinley's button for the election of 1896 is this, the talk to death. It just kind of as a little jab at William Jennings Bryan. But Republican William McKinley still wins and enacted the gold standard again. And the economy does even itself back out and kind of ends the debate for right now, because it seemed that the economy's fine, it gets in a better place. And so like people are a little less inclined to attack it. Also, because Republican won, it felt like it was just like the defeat of the populist movement after that. Like they tried their best and they didn't think they were going to get any farther. So why care about that election? This is the effect. It's the end of like the political slump, like the stalemate. While the populist movement is defeated, it starts a wave of reform mindedness. Even though it's kind of symbolically ended like the populist kind of movement, and has just, it was kind of like a sign to everyone saying, hey, okay, Republicans are dominant right now. Like, don't really challenge that right now. Republicans are dominant and industry is king because Republicans are in there. But it was a sign to Republicans that while they're in there, they can't just be complacent. They can't just be stagnant. They need to actually do things from now on. And those populist ideas, those political and economic reforms that they push for, like in the Omaha platform, will continue. Those will not just go away. They have now been brought up and they will continue until the period 7 when we talk about the progressive era. And then in class, we'll talk about how this whole time period is an allegory, or the Wizard of Oz is an allegory for populism, and make those connections. So yeah, that is the end of this unit.